Hi everyone, we're just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to filter in because we're expecting quite a lot of people today. But as you come on into the webinar, lots of us are working from home and everyone's joining online. So if anyone's ever popping where they're joining from in the chat and letting us know, it's always nice to see. Hi everyone who's joining. We're just giving everyone a couple of minutes to filter in before we start. We've got a lot of people joining this webinar today. So far, people are mainly down south. See if we get anyone else telling us where they're joining from. Carlisle, that's definitely north. Got a good split so far. Wow, people are joining from all over the place. So far, everyone's in the UK. It'll be interesting to see if anyone isn't. We'll just give everyone one more minute to join before we get going. There we go. We've got someone abroad. We've got someone in the Netherlands. Hi, Sarah. I think that's the furthest someone's joined from so far. People are still joining thick and fast, so we'll just give everyone another 30 seconds and then we'll get going. Someone else in the Netherlands.
Saw Glasgow mentioned as well, Betty. I don't know if that qualifies for overseas.
True, it's kind of pretty far away, isn't it? You can drive, I guess. Perfect. We've got people joining from all over. I think we're going to get started now, and anyone else can just join us as we go. So welcome to the first webinar in our series, Lunchtime and Level Up with Dan Haslam. Today, we're privileged enough to be collaborating with Qdos. So just to start by introducing myself, I'm Betty and I work here at Giant Group as part of the marketing team, especially focusing on our events and webinars, and I'll be the host today. So today's webinar is going to cover recent HMRC activity and an update on the recent IR35 legislation amends. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to share with you our observations of recent enforcement action by HMRC in a number of areas that affect the contingent workforce, as well as last year's update to legislation regarding the offset rule for taxes due under IR35. The use of contingent workers continues to increase as businesses look to increase their workforce agility, and so understanding the legislation and ensuring compliance remains pivotal for businesses. We'll focus today on flagging the changes and areas where you should remain vigilant, as well as discussing how you can form the right approach for your organisation to remain compliant. We expect there to be lots of questions today, so please use the Q&A function that you can see at the top of your screen. We will use the end 20 minutes to address as many questions as we possibly can. So today's webinar is brought to you by the Giant Group, who've been a leading contingent workforce management company for 30 years, and Qdos, the UK's leading provider of IR35 review services, as well as contractor insurances. The areas we'll cover today include HMRC activity focusing on clients engaging sole traders, HMRC activity surrounding statement of work and consultancy arrangements. Then we'll look at IR35 Chapter 10, Update 13, looking at how Qdos are supporting their clients. And finally, we'll look at the updates to the IR35 offset rules and the potential impact on the market. We'll then finish by answering all of your questions, or as many as we can. So our keynote speakers, firstly, are Nicole Slowey, Operation Director for Qdos. Nicole's focus is on supporting hiring organisations and agencies as they manage their contingent labour compliance pragmatically. Having worked with over 200 plus agencies and hiring organisations across a range of industries, Nicole has seen firsthand how compliance can be met, operational standards maintained and commercial advantage gained. We also have Nigel Nordone, Head of Tax at Qdos, who has personally represented hundreds of clients under IR35 inquiry and is a former HMRC Inspector of Taxes specialising in IR35, tax investigations, status PAYE and employer compliance. From Giant, we have Dan Haslam, who is our Group Sales Director, and his role includes helping clients to manage their contingent workforce compliantly and cost-effectively using the whole range of Giant services and products. Dan is a regular speaker at many events looking at contingent workforce trends. He helps update hirers, recruitment MSP and RPOs on how they can manage their contractor workforce, focusing in particular on how they manage risk and cost effectively, whilst not forgetting the candidate experience to ensure they have a value proposition for their contingent as well as permanent workforce. The way this will work today will be for Nicole, Nigel and Dan to address a number of set questions which I'll put to them in order to update us on the recent activity from HMRC and the recent legislation update on IR35, as well as discussing practical ways to mitigate the risks associated. There'll be an opportunity at the end for me to ask your questions. So like I said, please submit them via the chat function or the Q&A tool. So we can look at them at the end, but just pop them in as we go through the session. Amazing. Now, without further ado, let's begin to ask the experts some questions. Let's start with taking a look at some recent enforcement action from HMRC and where this may highlight some areas for companies to focus on. So hi, Nigel. It's nice to have you here today. For some time now, recruitment agencies have been tasked when engaging contractors as sole traders to ensure relevant taxes are being paid, with the obvious exception of construction workers using the CIS scheme. However, end hirers still often engage sole traders without understanding the risks. Could you begin by explaining to us the risks associated with sole trader engagements?
Hi, Betty. Thanks for inviting me. Essentially, when end hirers engage sole traders directly, the risk that they have is that if they were unfortunate enough to have a visit from our friends at HMRC and are subject to a tax investigation, HMRC might deem that the sole traders aren't generally self-employed and in fact should be classed as employees for tax purposes of the end hirer. This would mean that they would essentially have to pay pay-as-you-earn tax and national insurance in respect of any payments they made to the sole traders. Obviously, when deciding the status in respect to sole traders engaged directly by end hirers, it's the key status test that HMRC will always consider, similar to the way they do to in IR35, personal service control, mutuality obligations, and then any further supporting tests around financial risk in business owner account, etc. In respect of agencies who engage sole traders, it's slightly different because if the end hirer engaged is a sole trader via an agency, then the risk sits with the agency. So again, if HMRC carry out an investigation and deem that the sole traders, in their view, aren't generally self-employed, then it's the agency that has to pay the tax and national insurance. And this is because the agencies fall under what's known as the agency legislation, section 44, for those that are interested. And the only aspect that HMRC look at in respect to the status test is around supervision, direction and control. So if they deem that the end hirer is supervising, directing and control the sole trader, then the agency legislation applies and then pay-as-you-earn needs to be deducted from those payments made to the sole trader.
Thanks so much for that, Nigel. Nicole, perhaps I can bring you in on this point. Have you seen any recent examples of HMRC activity in this area?
Thanks, Betty. Hi, everyone. So just kind of continuing on one of the points that Nigel made there, specifically on section 44, the way in which that piece of the legislation is structured in itself is quite a significant deterrent. So we actually don't typically see recruitment agencies engaging sole traders as a result of the complexities and the financial risk that the legislation presents. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't other organisations who are caught by the agency legislation, and there could be and has been HMRC activity there. But looking at general status across the board, we don't see a huge amount of activity at a client level where HMRC are looking to establish the compliance position of end hirers engaging sole traders. Now, like I say, in the agency side of things, that's because of the way the legislation is set up, there's a large deterrent. From an HMRC resource perspective, IR35 has been such a big focus for compliance activity since the reform in 2017. We've obviously had private sector reform in 2021. So that's definitely where we're seeing most of HMRC's efforts in terms of engaging with medium and large organisations and understanding their compliance position. Now, what I would say, and definitely with the experience that Nigel and I have had in supporting clients going through off-payroll compliance checks, is that it's quite easy to see that HMRC can also use this as an avenue to not only look at off-payroll workers in the context of PSCs and limited company contractors, but actually off-payroll workers across the entire client's portfolio as well. So whilst it's not an area where we've seen a substantial amount of activity under the off-payroll working rules is definitely an opportunity for HMRC to really ramp that up and also start to profile clients who are engaging with workers on a sole trader basis.
That's perfect. Thanks for that insight, Nicole. And then just to come to you, Dan, in your experience, when you work with private sector clients, what parts of the market do you see sole trader activity in the most?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. We have definitely seen quite a bit of activity, actually, in terms of different sectors. It seems to be particularly prevalent in areas like retail, marketing, so design freelancers, people that are creating marketing content for businesses. Seen quite a lot of it in media and broadcasting as well. And more recently, I've seen some examples in sport clubs and charities that tend to engage or have a propensity for engaging people on a sole trader basis. I think it's predominantly where, you know, it's very short-term engagements. It's almost, I wouldn't go as far as to say casual, but it's very much, you know, a couple of days here and a couple of days there. And it's just been the way that businesses have engaged contractors for a period. But I've also seen examples where it starts to progress from that casual piece where assignments are being increased and they can start stretching over a period of weeks or months. Completely agree with Nicole and Nigel in respect of the recruitment agency piece. Don't often see sole trader engagement there, except obviously for CIS. Although it's interesting that it seems that even CIS engagements are being stress tested by HMRC with a number of high profile agencies reviewing whether or not they want to continue operating in that way because of the potential risks. But another area where I see a lot of sole trader engagement is actually via online recruitment platforms, both based in the UK and also those that offer services in different countries and different locations. It seems that for a period of time, the platform sort of marketplace has grown sort of outside of the focus of rules around being a recruitment agency and the enforcement that we have certainly in the UK around that. And I think for a prolonged period of time, the platforms has felt that they're not necessarily recruitment businesses, they're providing other services. So I'm not so sure if that's an easy argument to take forward, and you know, not for the folks on this session, but there's definitely European legislation coming down the road around platforms engaging contractors, you know, gig economy type workers, and actually looking at a default approach of them being treated as workers as opposed to self-employed. So it's definitely out there. It's definitely used, probably a little bit outside of the recruitment engagement piece, but certainly direct by clients. And as always, HMRC, when they're looking at enforcement activity, they'll tend to focus on the high profile brands for them to be able to get market noise and attention to show that they are doing enforcement. So for example, in media, I'm aware of a number of big corporate media businesses that have been under the spotlight around sole trader engagement for a lot of their sort of TV and broadcasting areas, and that's been going on for a number of months now.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And so if there are risks associated with these engagements, then how can businesses protect themselves?
Well, shameless plug for Qdos, I suppose. For sure, it's absolutely important to take some advice externally, and obviously the guys on the call today It's their absolute mantra to be looking at worker classification and status checks. So I think definitely be looking, if you are going to engage sole traders, to stress test this SDC point, supervision, direction and control, conduct an exercise on that, record those results, and if you're happy that the people are genuinely self-employed, then fine, engage them in that way, but make sure that you keep records of that activity. I'm sure Nigel will know from his time on the other side of the fence with HMRC that if HMRC are going to look at the situation, they'll look to see that you've got a process, and they'll be glad to hear that you've got a process around assessing the worker classification piece, but they'll equally want evidence as well. So you need to make sure you're keeping records of that. I think also the safest approach really would be to look at trying to introduce an intermediary between those workers. You know, if those contractors being paid on a sole trader basis are genuinely paying their taxes via self-assessment, then why not operate them through an intermediary like an umbrella or a PEO or through their own limited company to ensure that taxes are being deducted? Certainly in the scenarios where I've seen reasonable numbers of sole traders being engaged, that seems to be the conclusion that the hirer is coming to, that they want to introduce an intermediary that can step in, similar to IR35, and actually make sure the right taxes are paid and give them that certainty on the compliance piece.
Thanks, Dan. Just to remind everyone at this point, if you have any questions on any topics that are coming up, then please use the chat function or the Q&A button, which should be at the top of your page. We'll be ready to answer them at the end. And then Nicole, if I can come back to you now on the topic of statements of work. Following the introduction of the off-payroll working rules, many have observed a significant increase in the use of consultancy or statement of work contracts. What do you think is the reason for this?
Well, principally the fact that there is a section that exists within the off-payroll working rules that basically sets out that if an organisation is in receipt of fully contracted out services, then they do not need to or have any obligations from an IR35 perspective. It would be the provider of those services who's engaging the workers who has the responsibility for administering IR35. So because there is this exemption that existed, it was an opportunity for some organisations to an extent, mark it as a bit of a silver bullet in terms of here is a solution where some businesses can circumvent IR35. That's obviously the cynical view of it. Equally, there are organisations out there who have always and legitimately provide contracted out services as part of their offering to their clients. And by virtue of having those robust structures in place, that meant that actually they themselves as a service provider carried that IR35 responsibility and obligation, and not the clients they were delivering that service into. Now, the kind of challenge that the exemption represented was that, to my earlier cynical perspective, is that opened the gateway for lots of companies and organisations to look at quick fixes and get around to try and solve an IR35 problem, when ultimately, if there are contractors in the supply chain providing services via their own PSCs, someone in the supply chain actually has to undertake an IR35 determination. They have the obligation, the responsibility, and they will carry the financial risk. So I could understand why lots of people were quite attracted to those types of solutions, but ultimately the way in which fully contracted out services provided is actually quite starkly different to a conventional time and materials resource set up with a recruitment agency. And a lot of the work that we've done at Qdos, I know that Dan spent a lot of time talking about this, is really educating organisations on what the hallmarks of good arrangements look like and what the hallmarks of potentially contrived arrangements look like. Because essentially, if organisations find themselves in a situation where they have not undertaken any IR35 based determinations on workers, who HMRC then establish, in fact, they did have responsibility for managing their IR35 status and compliance, the client is at risk for having not executed their IR35 responsibilities properly. So they are liable at that point for having not actually fulfilled anything. So I think really for me, with the popularity around contracted out services and statement of work, and I know that Dan's got a kind of really good perspective on this as well, is that There are organisations out there who do it well and who do it properly and are quite compliantly providing fully contracted out services to their clients. And they typically have milestone or fixed fee based payment structures. The service provider is actively participating in the fulfilment and the delivery of the service. The supplier is actually liable and responsible for delivering those key milestones. And those are just some kind of high level ideas around what should kind of constitute in a legitimate contracted out services type structure. The converse of that, and what we don't expect to typically see within a legitimate contracted out services arrangement, is where contractors are being named. We've got people being provided on a time and material basis as opposed to on outcomes and deliverables. The service provider isn't actually participating in the fulfilment of the service. They're literally introducing resources and acting and behaving much more akin to a recruitment agency. So those are the kind of the main reasons why we've seen such a spike. But there are legitimate suppliers and providers out there, but there are equally organisations who potentially are at risk or maybe haven't considered whether they're actually in receipt of contracted out services, and that's where there's a potential risk and black hole for some organisations who maybe have a risk that they're perhaps unaware of because they've not sought to establish the nature of the relationship between them and one of their suppliers.
Thanks for that, Nicole. And then Nigel, perhaps you can share with us what activity you've seen from HMRC in this area and how they approach the assessment of these arrangements.
I mean, HMRC are very active. They're very active in carrying out reviews of how off-payroll working rules have been implemented since 2021. And as part of those reviews, contracted out services is an area that they're looking at. And essentially, what they're trying to find out is what processes are in place, who's been involved in deciding something is a genuine contract out service, obviously the client and the supplier. And it's definitely an area that they see there is a big risk in, and questions they look to do when they carry out review. They obviously want to know who is supplying the client with contract out services. They want to know how the services work in practice. They want to know the nature of the service they're in receipt of. They want to know whether it's like the contract out supplier is supplying both labour and materials. They also need things like if there's an issue with a contract out service, who's responsible for answering any questions or dealing with it on behalf of the supplier. And they also want to know the costs involved. So it's, like I said, it's a very big part of what they're checking. And prior to Christmas, I sat at a round table with HMRC, and they have said that they're going to be updating their guidance in employment status manual about contract out services, because if you do happen to have a few spare minutes and want to read that, it's not clear as to who would be liable if HMRC carried out a review and deemed that the service in that the client's in receipt of isn't a genuine contracted out service. During this conversation, HMRC basically said it would always be the end client. So we then questioned, well, as with off payroll, as with other parts of the revenue guidelines, can you demonstrate reasonable care? And in HMRC's view, and this is actually what they told us on the day, they do not believe that anyone can demonstrate reasonable care when it comes to outsourced services. In other words, if you're in receipt of what you think is a contract out service and HMRC decide that it isn't, then you're picking up the liability. You won't be able to argue it away.
Nigel, to come in there then, sorry, just because that's really, really interesting, because I think the market would generally think if there's a contracted out service being supplied, then absolutely the risk sits with the consultancy that's delivering that. But what you're saying there is that actually if HMRC are of the opinion that if that is stress tested, then actually reasonable care couldn't have taken place and that debt transfer could go up to the higher.
Yeah, essentially that's what they're saying. And when they update the guidelines, or this is what they've told us, when they update the guidelines, they will make it clear that it's the end, because one of the comments was made was, but your guidance doesn't state where the liability would sit. It's always been, and it still is a grey area. But that was their view, and their other view was that one person limited company contractors cannot supply contract out services. Now, obviously, we disagree with that as well. So, but disagreeing with HMRC is nothing new. So, but in 2023, we saw the Tax Centre of Excellence assessment, and basically it was the kind of the criteria that HMRC applied when considering contracted out services. If you can locate it, it's definitely worth a read, but it's very, very risk averse, unsurprisingly, on HMRC's part. So so they are trying to update the guidance, they are trying to give more information, but essentially, if you're ever unfortunate to have enough payroll review, then expect that contract out services will form a major part of their questioning about it.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Nigel. Dan, did you have any other observations on the use of statement of work contracts, or any other thoughts?
Well, I think it was really interesting what Nigel was saying there, just in terms of the potential risk and how that might transfer back up to the client. That will certainly spook some people in the market, because I do think that it's difficult. It's always easy to be dramatic when we're talking about things like IR35 and risk. Like, let's be clear that it is perfectly legitimate for businesses to engage with consultancies. It happens all over the place. We've seen it in the UK and overseas, and it's absolutely fine to do so on that basis, as long as obviously the contract is structured in the appropriate way and the mechanics of that engagement. And I think that it has been super popular post IR35 because of that perception of the tax risk being sat with the consultancy. So again, interesting that Nigel's flagged that actually in HMRC's view, that's not necessarily the case. I think certainly in 2017, when the off-payroll working changes hit public sector, I saw some extremely poorly executed arrangements where contractors were put into a statement of work arrangements, but spookily the milestones were on a 12-month basis, which meant absolutely no change to payroll frequency for a lot of these contractors. They were absolutely submitting hours and days, and in my view that was clear body shopping of contractors. And as we've seen from HMRC's activity, they've been all over the public sector in stress testing lots of off payroll arrangements, and I would expect that to be the case into the private sector. I'm definitely hearing more and more from clients and from consultancies contacting us to say, we actually do want to review how we're engaging contractors on our arrangements, and they're looking for advice and support in those areas. I don't think I would be as dramatic as to say it's a second wave of IR35 changes coming through, but their intent with the Excel that Nigel referenced, which is a sort of mini CEST version, for want of a better phrase, for statement of work, means that HMRC are absolutely looking at stress testing these arrangements. I do get nervous sometimes when we're speaking to some clients who will be very clear that they engage consultancies and they're absolutely sure that it's statement of work and it's all set out correctly, but they will then say, but Dan, is it okay if you fire up your timesheet text so that we can have day rates coming through and hourly rates to payroll these workers? So and then that in and of itself is not hook, line and sinker that it's not a genuine statement of work arrangement, but it is a red flag. If contractors are going to be paid on that basis, try and cascade down the milestone payments flowing all the way through. Certainly a better way to approach it. But I think for the most part, consultancies are genuinely keen to get it right and make sure that they are engaged correctly. But there's definitely more HMRC activity going on out there, and that's driving inquiries into us from consultancies, and interestingly also consultancies that form part of bigger recruitment groups as well, who I think are also seeing that HMRC are asking more questions in this area.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to add to there, Dan, was that, and I don't know if this is a point you were going to make as well, Nigel, that we're seeing a similar increase in that, and I think what it demonstrates is there's still a real opportunity for education in that space, because whilst people getting their ducks in a row from an off-payroll perspective, looking at where their contingent labour population sits, they're now thinking it will actually, we have our procurement function, and it's our procurement function that's responsible for engaging with our consultancy firms that we use for various different projects or pieces of work within the business. And only now are some organisations joining the dots. And I know that in the last year or so, Nigel and I have had a few clients who were completely hot on their approach to managing off payroll, but very recently realised that they hadn't necessarily done an appropriate amount of due diligence within their procurement function, and they had a bit of an unknown black hole of, well, we actually have quite a lot of how we would define contracts out service providers, but we don't really know if they use limited company workers or not. We didn't do that next level of due diligence. So there's definitely space for that continued education, and would absolutely encourage any organisation who is a big user of, especially in the IT space, any technology consultancy firms to have a look at and see and revisit what work that they did ahead of IR35 reform, specifically looking at the portfolio of contracted out service providers that they might have on their books.
The only thing I was going to add, sorry, is, and this is a shameless plug for Qdos, and I admit it, is that during that meeting with HMRC back in October, because there was myself and 17 agencies there, I explained that when we review contract out services, we review the MSA, we review the working practices, and we draft like a 8, 9, 10-page report highlighting the good, the bad, the indifferent, and putting forward suggestions how things could be improved. And begrudgingly, the HMRC officers did say, well, in that case, we may consider reasonable care. So, I mean, it wasn't a definitive yes, but to me, my thought would be, how did they argue that it wasn't? So it's just something to bear in mind.
Yeah, like we said earlier, if you've taken the time to have a process and you've got some evidence to back up that you've tried stress testing this, then yeah, you'd feel that it would be a little bit difficult to say that you've not tried to take some form of care. I think just finally on this point, like again, when I'm looking at clients that have got large contractor populations, in enterprise level clients, there is always at least another 50% of contractors that would appear to be engaged via these consultancy type arrangements. And so, again, not to say that every single consultancy arrangement is disguised employment, but I think there's an acceptance for a lot of MSP providers and a lot of providers that operate in this space that, yeah, you probably need to start shaking that tree a little bit and start getting stuck into some of that detail. And to Nigel's point, I think, why give HMRC an in? Because once they come in and they start to ask questions on one particular topic, you see it all the time, very easy for them to start branching out and then going, okay, let's review X, Y, and Z. And before you know it, you're really tied into a big investigation. So if you're not already looking at it, probably good to start reviewing those SOW arrangements.
Okay, amazing. Thanks, everyone. We're now going to move on to IR35 and specifically have a look at the recent IR35 Chapter 10 Update 13. Nigel, please could you explain the changes and what it means in practice for the audience?
Yeah, back in December 23, HMRC updated their guidelines in respect of payroll rules. Now, I must stress that they haven't actually changed the rules in any way. It's more putting forward what they consider as best practice in respect of how you implement the off-payroll rules, etc. And it was just guidance around things. And for those who are interested, it was contained in Guidelines for Compliance 4, which is their snappy title, or known as GFC4. So if you want to look that up, that's where it is. But essentially, it covers off points like training staff in respect of IR35, keeping records, as Dan's alluded to earlier. The thing with HMRC, if you answer any question that HMRC asks you, HMRC will always want to see the documentary evidence to support what you've told them. So it's always important to document everything that helps support why you believe you're engaging contractors outside of IR35. Things about issuing SDSs and what the SDS should contain, outsourcing off payroll working responsibilities, so companies such as Qdos, and basically just what would happen if you made an error and you needed to correct it, you know, RTI, all that sort of stuff. But essentially, it's as part of the reviews we're involved in respect of payroll, what they want to know is that all the staff who are involved in dealing with off-payroll workers are trained in respect of IR35 and understand IR35, that it's a central team who have the overall responsibility, because obviously if it's cascaded around the business, then you could have the risk of people doing their own thing rather than following whatever the business guidelines are, etc., in relation to engaging off payroll workers. So it's all about the best practice that HMRC believe that a business needs to implement when engaging off payroll workers. So like I said, it's not a change to the rules, it's just HMRC's guidance as how they think you should process the off payroll rules in respect to PSCs.
Thank you so much, Nigel. I think that's a really key takeaway for all of us today. Thank you for that insight. And then coming to you, Nicole, how are you working to support Qdos's clients with these changes?
So the biggest thing for us around any sort of update that HMRC provides, whether it's specifically on guidance or potential of any changes, which obviously I know we're going to come to talk on a bit about in a minute about the offset position, which is a change, is education. So making sure that clients and agencies that we engage with know what the updates are, sharing that in bite-sized digestible snippets. Because I think as well, if we take the guidance that Nigel was referring to, there is a section in there where they've updated some information around contracted out services, which we've just been speaking about. But the examples that are in there are very far away from how most recruitment agencies or organisations working in the professional services sector would engage a consultancy firm. So I think one of the examples was around waste refuge collectors. That was a really odd example, because the reality is those individuals providing those services are probably unlikely to be PSCs. So there's no IR35 risk or consideration there. So again, it's about making sure that we can kind of bring to life practically what some of that guidance means in real life examples for the clients that we engage with. To Nigel's point, stressing the need for training. So we've seen it in a lot of the engagement that we've had with HMRC on cases of late, really wanting to understand what training has your organisation done for the staff who are responsible for managing off payroll, and making sure it's not this one tick box exercise that existed ahead of reform and we've got a process and a policy but we've not actually looked at it. So making sure that you're refreshing and looking at it on at least an annual basis, establishing, okay, is our IR35 process fit for purpose, and does it meet the needs that we need to be able to demonstrate as our organisation? And I think importantly, using our voice, so like sessions like this, and thanks again to Dan and Giant for inviting us along, in terms of making sure that organisations who are in our position are being quite vocal on what we're learning from the types of activity that HMRC are pursuing, what we are seeing perhaps in other organisations, and any insights and information that we can share to make sure that businesses are fully kind of cognizant of the challenges that they might face if they find themselves in that situation, and equally as well to kind of, where possible, to try and lobby and or influence in any way we can HMRC narrative and policy. Whilst I would never profess us to be the kind of within that lobbying category, it's important for organisations who kind of represent the flexible workforce, who represent recruitment agencies and hiring organisations, that we can make their perspectives known and the challenges that the types of legislation and activity that HMRC introduces, and the way that could potentially be problematic for them. So the kind of using our platform to share that message is really important to us as well.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. We also understand that HMRC have made updates to IR35 offset rules. And this has had an impact on the potential liabilities for contractors. Please, could you explain the issue that the government wanted to address and what the impact is for these contractors, Nigel?
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to say this guidance and this legislation should have been brought in before they actually rolled out the off-payroll rules. It would have made sense. But effectively, from April of this year, any taxes that are due where HMRC deemed that an outside determination is incorrect and they deem that the contractor should be assessed as inside IR35 and therefore pays your own tax, NIC, etc. is due, then any taxes paid by the contractor can be offset against the liability for the end client, effectively reducing the amount of tax, NIC, etc. that the end client will have to pay. Obviously, the impact for that on the contractor is because under the current legislation, if an end hirer is deemed to have got a status determination statement wrong, in other words, issued an outside determination when HMRC view that it should have been an inside determination, the end hire has to pay the tax / insurance, or the fee payer does, depending on whether the end hire, there is an agency / fee payer in the chain, or whether the end hire can show reasonable care or not. But in that scenario, the contractor can actually put in a repayment claim to have the taxes that they'd had deducted through their self-assessment repaid to them through their corporation tax return. So HMRC would get the tax from the end client, and then the contractor could have a repayment. Now, obviously, in the set-off from April 2024, then that can't happen. If the end client has a set-off scenario, then the contractor can't claim the repayment. Obviously, the impact for hire is that it reduces any liability that they may have to pay, which hopefully will lead some of them to be less risk averse and therefore more willing to engage with limited company contractors. But it's important to know that if you're unfortunate from the process of being, part of enough payroll review, and any liabilities are sort of deemed to be due and payable now, pre-6th of April, you can ask HMRC to postpone any payments until after the 6th of April, so you can take advantage of this new legislation. And HMRC are more than amenable to do that. They're happy to go along with that, and that they have no qualms about doing so. The other major factor to note that it only applies to the off-payroll rules. So any contractors who are under inquiry with HMRC under Chapter 8, the rules that were in place from 2000, this legislation doesn't apply to them. So they, in theory, could be taxed twice on the same income. And that's the problem with the current legislation. There is two lots of tax available. For HMRC to actually offer the set-off, there has to be a trigger event. And by that, I mean, HMRC have to deem that an outside determination is incorrect and that the contractor should have been assessed as inside of IR35. But it's a piece of legislation that I haven't heard anyone say they don't agree with, and it's good for the end clients. It's good for the contractor population, because, like I said, hopefully it'll lead to end hirers engaging contractors more regularly, more openly. So well done, HMRC, on this one, and I don't say that very often.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Nicole, did you have any further thoughts on this topic at all?
I would just echo what Nigel said. It's a welcome change, and it should have been something that was factored into the original legislation, so it just rebalances the playing field and effectively takes away any mechanism for HMRC to collect double tax. So I think it's fairer, albeit we're talking about a reasonably unfair piece of legislation. It's a fairer application from a liability perspective. So it's definitely something that we are glad that it's coming in sooner rather than later. There's obviously a bit of there is a technical consultation that's open at the minute to get into the nitty-gritty of what the collection mechanism will be for that and the calculations around that. But that is more of a formality than anything else, and that will be coming into force from April this year.
Thanks so much for that, Nicole. So this is the last question reminder now. So if anyone has any, please get them in the Q&A function or in the chat. Get them in while you still can, and we'll be answering them super soon. But coming back to you, Dan, we're just wrapping up now. Do you have any views here before we move on to some questions?
No, I just think, again, echoing what Nigel and Nicole have said with regards to the calculations. I mean, yeah, it should have been done before the rules. It wasn't. It was unfair, and it's being corrected. I don't personally think that you'll see too much change in the behaviours out there in the market. I think, yes, it lessens the financial risk for a client, but however, the risk was already quite high. Hence why overwhelmingly the public and private sectors showed that they are very much risk averse in its reaction to IR35, and I still think that will largely remain the same. I haven't seen any feedback from clients post the offset rule changes coming through to signify that there could be some changes in behaviour. But again, like we said on SOW, I think it's important to say that you can engage contractors outside of IR35. And clients will take a view based on not just the views on what, them being able to attract talent into their business, but also bigger factors around reputational risk and not wanting to pick a fight with HMRC. And that's the unfortunate position I think that we're in off the back of this legislation, which there probably are a number of contractors who perhaps could be engaged on an outside basis that have found themselves caught inside because they're engaged and working for companies that are, are risk averse at heart, and they don't want to pick a fight with HMRC. That said, as well, in terms of the talent shortages that we see from a recruitment perspective in the market, it's becoming more and more difficult for people, not just in the UK, but overseas, to attract talent. So there is a demand, I think, from the TA teams and from recruitment businesses to make sure that clients will be flexible and open on whether they can engage inside or outside. But ultimately, are clients going to get comfortable enough with that to take that risk? I think we just have to sort of wait and see, but I'm probably a pessimist at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for sharing your insight today. I know I've learned a lot in this session, so I hope that all of you who've joined have also found this really useful. I think the key takeaways today are that it's clear that the legislation continues to evolve, as well as understanding HMRC's approach to enforcement and where they're focusing their resources currently. As we thought, we've received lots and lots of questions, so I'm going to start to pose some of these to the experts, and we'll see where we get to. Dan, I'm just going to open the Q&A function and start to have a look, but while I do that, could you just give a few examples of what professions would be classified as sole traders?
Yeah, no, sure, we can do. And just to say, guys, I know I can see all the questions coming through as we've been talking. So I think we'll probably work with Nigel and Nicole post this event to do some answers to any that we don't get to, and we'll share that as part of the follow-up if you guys are okay with that. So in terms of sole trader engagement, then the big one is often in construction. So sole traders engaged on construction sites and being payrolled through the CIS construction industry scheme. That's quite prevalent in the market, but sort of outside of construction, lots of different examples. So I've seen football coaches being engaged as sole traders, people that work on match days as sole traders, in charities, people that go around to collect charity donations often are engaged as sole traders. Charities that engage with activists, paying them as sole traders. In broadcasting, often the film crews and the beauticians and the people that are involved in setup of film arrangements tend to be paid on a sole trader arrangement, and there are some separate rules around worker classification for some areas. I'm sure Nigel probably knows more about that than I do, but there are some special rules around that. So sole trader engagements pop up in lots of interesting places. Don't tend to see it too much in professional services. It absolutely tends to be PSE engagements, in those arrangements. But you'd be surprised actually, and often, as I mentioned, on platforms as well, marketing's another big one. A lot of marketing freelancers being engaged as sole traders, and often platforms are happy to engage them on that basis rather than how a recruitment agency would need to operate by paying an intermediary, whether that's an umbrella or a PSE.
Amazing, thank you. Gabriel's asked, does anyone know how sole traders rules affect medical businesses? For example, existing PAYE medical practitioners who might need to do some out of hours work on a regular basis.
Effectively, the rules are the same as if you were a carpenter or in the media, whatever it is. Essentially, when it comes to affecting status and sole trader status, it's always the key status test that HMRC look at. That's all they're interested in. Providing you can show you're generally self-employed. I mean, obviously pay as you earn income doesn't come under, we don't have to worry about status of that, providing you can generally show that you're self-employed. And as I said, if HMRC asks you a question, you can answer that question and support that with evidence, then it's no different to any other self-employed person.
Perfect, thank you. And then we also had this question from David, who said, Nicole, are there many cases you've handled where the client has done a CEST test which returned a does not apply result from HMRC, but HMRC have then successfully challenged this?
So there have been some situations with case law where there have been particular determinations that have been undertaken where the CES determination tool has supported one position from an IR35 status perspective, but the actual outcome of the relevant tribunal has actually proved a point to the contrary. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but it's one that we can give you a bit of an overview, David, because there are some situations where the CES tool has been used both in HMRC's favour, but actually they've also had some cases, and I'm thinking back to some cases maybe 2019-ish, where HMRC were actually calling for CES determinations to be excluded from evidence. So it's a bit of a tricky one that HMRC is used for in support of its own position in some situations. In other instances, it actually hasn't. But it's something we can share as a follow-up to give you some insight on that point, David.
Amazing, thank you. We've had lots and lots of questions about like the political projection of what IR35 looks like. So if we have changes to government or just in general over time, what the changes could be. Does anyone feel like they can give some insight on that today?
Have we got a crystal ball? I have had, unsurprisingly, we've had lots of conversations about this recently. I think if you go all the way back to 2000, when Nigel mentioned when IR35 legislation was first introduced, that happened under a Labour government. IR35 reform in the public and private sector happened under a Conservative government. Dan and I were just catching up before this call, talking about some things that Labour are planning to do around workers' rights and an potential employment bill when they come in. IR35 and worker status is often used as a bit of a political hot potato. We obviously saw in the, which feels like a bit of a fever dream now, the Kwasi Kwarteng Liz Truss very short kind of period of tenure that they sought to repeal IR35 reform in their kind of very short period of time. So I think that it's difficult to say where any party is going to land on IR35 specifically. But employment status and workers' rights are something that both parties are speaking quite a lot about, but more specifically, Labour tend to be focusing quite a lot on this idea of an employment bill. But I wouldn't like to hedge any bets on which party would be in support of changes or potentially not.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nicole. Then Jane asked, many consultancies that supply statement of work services are small companies, and so IR35 legislation doesn't always apply. She said, this seems like an easy loophole for clients not wanting to pay so much and not taking any risk. Is HMRC looking to close this loophole at all?
Essentially, HMRC, there is no, I mean, there's no loophole for IR35 or for status. Every case is judged by the same status test, the same working practices reviews, contract reviews. So there isn't a loophole. I mean, you have, as we've touched on earlier, contracted out services where if someone is generally supplying a service to a client, then it's not the client's responsibility to assess the status of the workers. But that's not a loophole. That's how the legislation works, and all that does is mean that the supplier, if they're a medium or large business, they have the responsibility for issuing the status determination statements to the contractors. Obviously, if they're a small business, then they would still, the contractors will assess their own status under Chapter 8, the rules that brought in 2000.
I would just add, sorry, on you go, Dan.
Yeah, no worries. I was just adding in that I was actually talking to a consultancy about this last week, and they are currently a small consultancy business, but they're looking to grow, and they understand that they've got a small company exemption, albeit to Nigel's point earlier in the session, that's worth thinking about. If it's stress tested by HMRC, that the liabilities could still carry through to the client anyway. They understood that position, but they were still keen to make sure their operational model was such that they're engaging contractors in the right way, because they want to grow. And how tricky is it to keep your eye on your status as a company, whether you're small or not, when you're looking at the sort of payroll values that can be going through on contractors? Very, very tricky. So to Nigel's point, I don't think it's a loophole necessarily. I think it may be that people are leaning into it as a bit of a false hope. But actually, you should be making sure that, whether it's a small, medium or large business, just have the right engagement type. And if you're unsure, then get it checked out. Sorry, Nicole.
That was pretty much what I was going to say.
Amazing. Dan, you've just used the phrase again, stress test. Could you just define that for the audience?
Yeah, I think just taking your own views, having your own internal working group within the business as to why you believe that this arrangement is a contracted out service. Looking at areas like milestone payments, constructing payments to the consultancy at certain trigger points, and then seeking independent third-party advice. Whether that is Qdos, whether it's the other assessment services, or legal teams, to have a look at that. And stress test it, and if you've done that, you've kept a record of those checks that you've made, then it'd be tricky for HMRC to say that you haven't taken reasonable care in trying to ensure around the engagement. What I would go on to say, though, is that we see this regularly. Once a company's paid another company, there may be some assurance that that company is then engaging workers further down the supply chain in a compliant fashion. That is absolutely not the case all the time. We see many examples where end hirer thought, not on just SOW, but an end hirer thought that agencies were engaging contractors on an employed basis. Guess what? They're not. And we've seen examples of people paying gross outside of IR35. Arrangements where a consultancy has told the client that, their contractors are paid on a milestone basis, but they're not. Because someone in the supply chain is trying to leverage risk to gain a commercial benefit. They may get away with it, they may not get away with it, but as we've said on the session today, HMRC are absolutely zeroed in on this, and particularly targeting some of the larger businesses, and their approach is always to catch a scalp that will then set hers racing across the rest of the market. And I think it's only a matter of time until we hear more noise about it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I'm just going to pick out a couple more questions now, and then any others we can answer afterwards. So this question is thinking about the change of legislation from the 24th of April and HMRC collecting double tax. How would a business find out the tax contractors have already paid to deduct it from any monies due to HMRC after a review? And is that information the HMRC will provide?
Again, yeah, actually it is. HMRC will correlate or collate all the information in respect of taxes, and they will then come together and issue like a calculation showing the taxes paid by the contractor, the taxes paid or due from either the end hirer or from the agency, and then they will calculate the set off that way. So yes, HMRC will collate that information.
Amazing, thank you. And then, is it possible that the tax liability would ever go back to the contractor in any circumstances? For example, if the end hirer showed reasonable care and the contractor themselves provided false information in the status determination process, or is that something that we would never expect?
There is a little piece of the guidelines that basically said if the contractor, if within the chain there's fraudulent information deliberately supplied, then that risk could apply. But so it is there, but the risk is incredibly low if everything's done correctly, as in the contract hasn't deliberately gone out to defraud the end client in any way by giving false information. And we're not talking about the contractor thinking they can substitute when they can't, that sort of thing, but it's then the chances of the liability ever being passed to the contractor are slim to nil, basically.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time now, so we're going to wrap up for today. Thank you so much, Nigel and Nicole, for coming on and sharing your expertise with us. We appreciate it so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined today as well. I'll follow up tomorrow with a recording and an email, and in case anyone wants to watch this again or send it on to someone else who might be interested, as well as an opportunity to give us some feedback and also come and join us again next month. We really hope to see you again soon, but for now, bye everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks.